For those who are just joining, we will get started in about 5 minutes. So hang tight. And Raylan, thanks for being here today also. Have there been any conference highlights that anyone wants to share so far? The dismantling white supremacy session yesterday, I have to say, was really excellent. Sounds like that group has done that before. And I'll look forward to sharing the recording.
Yeah, I missed that session, but I went to the keynote speaker this morning, and especially some of the conversations that happened after her presentation, just so much food to thought, and just it got me a little bit in the heart and soul. So I don't think she said anything shocking to me, but to hear it all put together the way she did was powerful.
Yeah. Yeah, Angie shared in the chat. I just appreciate very much having a community of like-minded folks working for justice and food systems, all in one place for a few days. Just going to refill my tea and then we'll be right back. Thank you. Yeah, I feel that too. I think, these kinds of conferences, aside from obviously all the resource sharing and learning that's happening, just being around other people who are really committed to this work, it feels like, that's the energy, even in a virtual space. It feels like the energy that has been lacking for me in the last couple of years with the pandemic, to keep it all moving. While we're waiting for more people to come in too, I am also going to share a few links in the chat. And I'll post these again, but just so I don't have to go looking for them. And you all are welcome to check them out in the meantime. This first one is a resource for land acknowledgement. And I saw that the conference organizers had shared some land acknowledgement materials. So I don't know if this is something that they shared as part of that, but just a couple other URLs that might be of interest. Glad to see some other people joining. We'll have a chance towards the beginning to, especially if this is a small group, to go around and each share a little bit about who we are. And I'm really looking forward to meeting you all in this virtual space. Okay, it is 1 o'clock. Let's give folks just another minute. But in the meantime, you can open the chat and you'll see I posted a few links there. There's some things to check out. I'm also going to post a link in the chat for a Jamboard. If you're not familiar with Jamboards, it's a kind of Google share file that can be co-created. So the link that I'm sharing should allow you access to add posts and text there. And you'll see on the third slide, I've also added those links that I put in the chat earlier. So just redundancy for the sake of access, hopefully. And then we'll use some of these Jamboards, as we call them, to do some reflection together and share resources and share our contact information if that's something that you all are interested in, to stay in touch at the end. And it's 1 minute after 1 on my clock, so I think let's go ahead and get started. And I'll try to keep admitting people, but I think, Ren, if you see others joining that I miss, please feel free to add them in. And we are also so fortunate today to have a translator. So thank you to Doris for being here today to do that. We really appreciate it. I hope that is useful and valuable for the folks who are here or watching the recording afterwards. I am going to share my screen at this point, and I'll just share a few slides. And then we will spend most of this time together to be in dialogue, to have these critical conversations, for especially thinking about how land grant institutions can be more culturally competent and doing research that is community-based and participatory and action-oriented, particularly as we think about our positioning in these institutions, academic institutions. But I realize that not everyone here will be coming from a land grant institution. So I'm looking forward to hearing from you also about how land-based science education in general is part of this work for you. My name that you can see there on the Zoom screen also is Hannah Hemmelgarn. I'm the Assistant Program Director at the Center for Agroforestry, which is an organization within the University of Missouri system. Although we have outlying agricultural experiment stations or research centers all over the state and collaborations nationwide. Let's see if I can advance. And, you know, so often we see these land acknowledgements as openings. My hope is that this is not just an introductory piece, that it can really be a construct that we are thinking about throughout these critical dialogues we're having. But for context, as we start this positioning process, where I am in the place we now know as Missouri, I am on the land of the Wajaje, the Osage-Sakowin, Takiwa, Meskwaki, Chiwere, Nutachi, Ugashpa, Kikapoa, Illiniwek, Pacoche, Peoria, and other ancient communities and descendants of ancient communities we know as Folsom, Hopewell, and Clovis peoples. And I've shared the link to this native land map in the chat and also on that Jamboard slide for resource share. And what I want to point out here, if you go to that link, maybe you've been there before to learn more about whose lands you're on. Maybe you are among the communities of these ancestral stewards. But I think you know, this map does a really good job of acknowledging how imperfect this mapping process can be, that it is an ongoing process and it's complicated. That's my catchphrase lately, it's complicated. So you can see that, you know, these boundaries are not neat and tidy the way we like to make maps. This is a representation of the places people have lived over thousands of years, and through movement over time, migrations. So this is something they acknowledge on that website is that this is a work in progress. It is a collective map making, and it's imperfect. So it's always growing and changing, and you can be a part of that map making process. And one of the reasons this is particularly important for me and on my mind often in my work at the Center for Agroforestry is because I am in relationship with so many of these native plants who are here in the state that they're in because of the stewardship of the tending over millennia from these indigenous peoples that I named. So the images we're looking at here are ramps or Allium trichocum, wild leeks, elderberry, pawpaw, pecans, ginseng in that lower central photo, Panax ginkgofolius, American ginseng, and golden seal in the bottom right. These might be plants that you're familiar with. There are certainly many, many others that are important to our work. And we have begun this process of really being more mindful about what it means to be in relationship to these plants beyond, this sort of biophysical sciences realm, and really understanding the human dimensions of plant and land-based research. And so to go a little further in that positioning of myself and my work, this has all really come to a fore, and some new opportunities have arisen for this kind of relationship building because of a property that was given to the Center for Agroforestry a couple of years ago. And it's a farm where we had been doing some research before with medicinal forest botanicals. The landowner was very interested in perennial agriculture systems and also in indigenous land stewardship practices. So when he passed and gifted that land to us, he expressed his wish for that land to be a place where the Center for Agroforestry might begin more of this work in integrating, especially Osage, the Osage community, into our research, which aligned at a really nice time for me in growing more connected and having some more friendships with some members of the Osage community. And I included a quote here. You may be familiar with this article. I put the link also in the chat right there at the beginning. This is from an article called Land Grab Universities, with a really clever subtitle too that I can't remember. But Robert Lee and Tristan Ahtone are the authors from 2020. This is in High Country News. They did an incredible investigative journalism piece on this. And in describing the University of Missouri in this land grab institution context, all of the lands funding MU came from just 2 Osage treaties in 1808 and 1825. This was coming about from Meriwether Lewis, who offered the treaty to the Osage as an alternative to their extermination. So just, we think about like, oh, they signed over the land, it's a treaty, it's an agreement. And I don't think this is anything that's new to you all in this space, but those agreements, many, if not most of them, were not upheld. They were not respected, and were formed in a really unethical way. So, and this is, it's not something that happened in the past, and the book is closed. This is something that we're still benefiting from. The University of Missouri still benefits from nearly 15,000 acres of unsold Morrill Act lands. So that article really describes the Morrill Act, which is, if you're not already familiar, I highly recommend reading the full article, but that Morrill Act is what essentially made it possible for land grant institutions to exist. That was the land wealth transfer from indigenous nations, sovereign nations, for those land grant institutions to profit and to continue to thrive in the way that they are now. So this farm, research center farm that was gifted to the Center for Agroforestry is now named Land of the Osages Research Center, which it's been a collaborative process from the start with leadership from Osage Nation. And the image is here from the grand opening of that research center, which happened in 2019. And on the bottom right, this is a map from Osage Nation showing the extent of their ancestral territory on top of our existing understanding of the state boundaries. And you can see the purple county, there is the current Osage reservation land, and the purple or the red star, sorry, that's, whoops, it's not quite in the right place. The red star should be right up here near that MO. I think that shifted as things were moving around between slides. But the red star is where the Land of the Osages Research Center is, which is about 300 miles from Osage Nation current lands. And another important piece of this, as I've been working through this process and growing relationships, is the recognition that the self, ourself as researchers, is central to the search. And this is something that Sean Wilson and Kathleen Absalon, two Indigenous authors and researchers, have really highlighted for me, and I encourage you to check out their work also. But just as a little timeline for me in positioning, how am I connected to all of this? And I've mentioned some of this already, but I have been working for the Center for Agroforestry as their education program coordinator and transitioned into the program director role just in the last year. But in 2018, through my work with high school ag educators, I attended a conference on Oahu that was themed around Indigenous agricultural knowledges. And it was incredibly eye-opening for me in that I was able to see that this is really possible. It is possible to have Indigenous leadership at an academic institution and to have those research questions really integrated in a way that can benefit those communities, all of those communities, locally and regionally. And so the following year, inspired from that conference, I worked with a few individuals at MU to put together a little tiny grant project, internal grant project, to begin to build some relationships. And it was incredibly humbling. I think one of the big lessons for me there is that the relationships have to come first before we start writing grants and proposing projects. And luckily there's been a lot of forgiveness in that time. And then in 2019, as part of that grant project, I was fortunate to attend the White Earth Land Recovery Project's Indigenous Farming Conference. That's an annual event that happens in northern Minnesota on the White Earth Reservation. Winona LaDuke is a big part of organizing that event, and it is primarily serving the local Indigenous communities there. And then, of course, in 2019 was that opening of the Land of the Osages Research Center, or LORC. You might hear me refer to it as LORC. And then in 2020, the pandemic really hit and has slowed things down, which in some ways has been beneficial for us. I also became a mother, so that was kind of good timing for me to slow down in all of this. And through that, we have been meeting with our partners at Osage Nation. Dr. Andrea Hunter is the director of the Tribal Historic Preservation Office. Dr. Jan Heyman is the director of the Osage Department of Natural Resources, and Mary Wildcat is the director of the Education Department there. So we've been meeting with them about monthly to continue to learn and grow relationship, and as we start to form the advisory board for Land of the Osages Research Center. And in 2021, we hosted a virtual field day for that research center, including some of those people as presenters and others from the local community, and starting to think about what can this land be for all of us? Should it be for all of us? So these are some of the questions. You'll hear me bring up a few others that I want to bring to this conversation for us today. And then also this year, that final item on the list, we were awarded a USDA NEFA New Beginning for Tribal Students grant to start to bring Osage youth to Land of the Osages Research Center, for those community connections to start happening in a way that is promoting sovereign opportunities within the nation. And there will be a small group of full scholarships for Osage students to come to the University of Missouri, to the College of Agriculture, Food and Natural Resources, and work with us at the Center for Agroforestry and help teach us. So there's a lot of collaborative learning in these processes. So the first question that I want to get to, that was all just sort of context. And I may stop sharing my screen and just post this question in the chat, but I'd like for you to reflect for a moment about how you position yourself, your work, your livelihood, your organization or farm. If you are doing research, if you're teaching, how do you position all of that within this context of existing in a colonized space, wherever you are? And I encourage you in thinking about this to consider your multiple identities potentially, where you are, what experiences you've had in the place where you are, your biases, your privileges, your relationships. And so much of this for me has been rooted in sort of reconciling my own relationship to the only place that I know as home. I am a white settler person. I consider myself a white settler person. I am non-Indigenous, and I am dependent on the land that feeds me, that serves me, where my home is. So, that kind of, reconciling what is my place here? How can I learn to be in right relationship with my heart in the right place in doing this work? So let's take just a few minutes, and if I can figure this out, I am going to create some breakout rooms for us. Since we have, it looks like 14 participants, I will create 5 breakout rooms. So we'll just have 2 or 3 people in each one. And these will be created automatically. And Doris, if there are any concerns you have about interpretation through this, maybe I can stick around, you and I can stick around to chat about that. Otherwise, I will open all the rooms and I'll post these questions in the chat for us to think about. How do you position yourself, your work, your livelihood, and your identities in this context? Okay, it looks like everyone is back now. I hope that was a fruitful time for conversation, for beginning this, thinking about ourselves as central in all of this. So I want to just share or open up a little bit of time for you all to share about some of what was discussed in those breakout rooms, or just a little bit about your own positioning. So we can just go around the circle. And for those who might be muted or have your camera off, if you're willing to unmute and share your face, and that's great, but if not, that's okay too. So Angie, do you want to share a little bit about your own positioning?
Yeah, so my name's Angie Carter. I'm a sociologist at Michigan Tech University, which was established as a mining college. So like a land grant, it has a history in extractive models and production. And yeah, we're 45 minutes north of the Keweenaw Bay Indian community. and have no Anishinaabe representation in our staff or faculty at our university. And my department has only one member of our entire faculty isn't white. So it's a very predominantly very white institution. And so I shared how I'm very conscious of that and understanding why some folks may not want to come to our program, but then also trying to engage white students in our program in more critical consciousness about where we're at on these lands and what that means, especially in relation to the abundance and long history of foods. And I teach a food systems class. But that's something that's always on my mind, is trying to account for my time and putting energy into community work through the resources I can channel through my institution, knowing that my institution's not very committed on that front.
Yeah, those are such important points. And the University of Missouri is not much different. And the whole MU, the Columbia campus, there are 5 Native faculty, none of whom are Osage. And in the College of Ag, Food, and Natural Resources, where the Center for Agroforestry is housed, there are 0 Native faculty. It's it's just, one of these big issues that needs to be resolved in order to create space for these dialogues to start happening. But yeah, that's I appreciate your work, and that's something that, thinking about the curricula and the education within, acknowledging that we are in predominantly white institutions is something that we'll get to a little bit later about what we've done, and look forward to staying in touch with you to learn more about what you all have been working on there. Thanks, Angie. Ariana, I see you as the next person on my screen. If you want to share anything, you can also feel free to pass.
Well, in our discussion, we actually, I'm a student at Iowa State, and I discussed with Jean actually about Iowa State because she worked there and went to school there. So we both got to connect on that point, and sort of acknowledged how little Iowa State seems to take accountability for their relationship to the land and their history. And I mentioned wanting to maybe just see what's in the area and do more pointed research on that, just so I have a better understanding and can maybe build relationships as I live here.
Great. Well, I hope as I get into a little bit more about my own research, I hope that can in some way serve you, or we can keep in touch to share about how you're moving forward with that. Thanks. Kelsey, do you want to share?
Sure. So in our session, I think we talked a lot about our respective universities and areas and kind of what they are doing and or not doing to contribute to these issues. But to speak on my positionality, I'm a white cis woman enrolled at Mizzou and doing research work at a university, which, as Hannah said, still actively benefits from stolen Indigenous land. I study agroforestry, or the intentional combination of woody perennials with agriculture, which is deeply rooted in Indigenous knowledge. So I do benefit from Indigenous land and exist in a predominantly white institution, and study agroforestry, which is something that is often treated as this newly discovered thing in the 70s and 80s. And oh, wow, it's something that's been practiced it's ancient, and it's been practiced by civilizations for years. And so, yeah, I feel I do exist within those systems and structures that are unjust. And so trying to find necessarily where I can contribute, and I do believe that I can contribute, especially in agroforestry, and just sort of learning myself the true nature of those systems and where they came from, and perpetuating that in my work, hopefully. So.
Yeah, thanks, Kelsey. And if you didn't pick this up, Kelsey and We'll hear from Raylan too, but Kelsey and Raylan are both students I work with at the Center for Agroforestry. So I really appreciate that you both are here. And I think, so much of this in the positioning process and reflecting on who we are and where we are is uncomfortable when we start to think about this sort of unsettling nature of it. But that's the point, that it can be unsettling. Not entirely maybe, but that the discomfort is part of the work. So thanks for everyone being in that with me. Lisa S., I see you next on my screen.
Hi, everyone. So you may hear my cat yowling in the background. He's hungry and letting me know very ferociously. So I'm in Eastern Iowa. I'm in Iowa City, and I don't have any affiliation with, the University of Iowa. In that, like, I'm not a student there, but I do live in a community that is rich with resources because of the University of Iowa. So I guess I wanted to step into this conversation just out of interest of the topic. And I do have a background in horticulture and land restoration, and have a deep interest in perennial agriculture and ethnobotany. Like I said, so being in Iowa City and having access to a lot of resources and very smart people, either attending or teaching at the University of Iowa, I was able to be a part of an Obermann Center lecture. And I was just kind of a viewer, not a participant in that, but and that happened, oh gosh, last March, I would say, and it was titled like Native Lands Belonging and Reclaiming. It was just a conversation between someone affiliated with the Obermann Center and then two Native American women, Shelley Buffalo, who is the coordinator, was the former coordinator of the Meskwaki Food Sovereignty Initiative at the Meskwaki settlement in Tama County, and Carrie Shuttle Peltz, who's an enrolled member of the Lumbee tribe in North Carolina. And that was a really interesting conversation to listen to about, going beyond land acknowledgement and really what it means to belong to a Native American tribe from these women's perspectives and in terms of their relationship to the land. And Carrie's writing a book entitled The Indian Card, which is kind of based around the blood quantum system for measuring someone's right to membership, and Indian cards. And so while I guess I have, benefited from having these really smart people and interesting things happening in my community. And I work with a nonprofit organization, and we are part of like the Iowa Valley Scenic Byway, and part of the byway exists on the Meskwaki settlement. And I would really like to develop better relationships with folks there and really get involved in the work that they're doing and learn how our organization can support them. So anyway, that was kind of good, but
that's all great. And then when so much of this reflection and thinking about how do we respond, we'll have another opportunity for doing more of that. And I'm actually, as you're sharing these resources, I'm just going to post the Jamboard link again in here. And if you follow that link, for anyone who has resources to share on this topic, the third slide of that is for sharing those things that you've heard about that you think we should look into. So if you want to share about the book or the lecture series, anything like that, please use that space to do so. Raylan, I have you on my screen next, if you'd like to share.
Okay, so for everyone's context, I'm Raylan. I'm also a student at the University of Missouri in the same program as Kelsey. So coming to a lot of like similar realizations about the history of the University of Missouri, the history of agroforestry, and trying to really critically reflect where I fit in it all. I've been really acknowledging how educational systems have really improved my life and like boosted my ability to connect with other people, and then like who had to give for me to have these opportunities. And honestly, I'm still in a place of being extremely humbled, and in a place where I just want to open up and keep listening and figure out how I can best connect with someone on their level. Like I don't want to be imposing. I'm incredibly curious and I want to keep learning. So I've just kind of opened my heart, opened my ears, and here I am.
Thank you. That's a great place to be in all of this. Yeah. Thanks, Raylan. Susie, I have you next here.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I am Susie Techmeyer, and I am the Forestry, Agriculture, Botany librarian at Michigan State University Libraries. And I have ties to so many of you. I grew up partially in Iowa. My dad is an Iowa State graduate, and most of my dad's family is still up in Northwest Iowa, up in like Ida County, Iowa. And so go back and visit them on occasion. When I went to college, we were living in Kansas, but Kansas does not have trees, pretty much. And so I got to go to the University of Missouri on reciprocity, and I got my bachelor's degree in forestry with a minor in agronomy, long time ago. And after I graduated, I realized I don't like working outside. So eye opener there. And so I went back to college and I got my master's in library and information science. And I have had the pleasure of using my forestry plant science knowledge and apply it to the librarianship world. And now I have the wonderful position of being able to help people find what they need regarding agriculture, forestry, botany, ethnobotany resources, and making them available to them. And as I said, I'm at Michigan State, and we are also trying to acknowledge that because of the Morrill Act, we got lands for the land grant from everywhere in the state of Michigan. And we also acknowledge the Native American tribes from whom we signed our treaty contracts back in the early 1800s to set up the university. And in the last couple of years, I have one of the initiatives that we have participated here, especially in the libraries, is identify diversity, equity, and inclusion literature pertaining to MSU, and that I am been working with the agricultural fields. And so we're compiling lists of scholars of not just the academic literature, but also gray literature, magazine articles, theses, dissertations, and trying to bring those to the forefront of and acknowledge them for the research and the knowledge that they have produced, and making it more widely available to a larger readership.
And I'm so glad, Susie, that you are sharing about that, because that is such a big, interesting question too, of, you know, at what point, what kinds of information we are sharing, what access we have to information that may need to be shared or may need to be not shared, and kept protected within a given community. And these are really, you know, as a librarian, I think that's such an interesting perspective to be thinking about so many of these issues.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate your perspective on that. For the sake of time, I want
Yeah.
to keep moving, and if
Go right
we
ahead.
can keep it, if we can keep it as brief as possible. Just, I don't have many more slides, but I want to make sure we have time for a little more reflection at the end too. But this is all leading so well into so many of those critical dialogues to be having. So thank you. Jean, would you like to share?
Yes, so I've had a struggle with, so I grew up in Eastern Iowa, big users of extension, Iowa State Extension. And when I got a communications job working for Iowa State Extension 20 years ago, I was so excited because I had so much respect for that organization, that part of Iowa State. And I saw how it kind of transformed agriculture and other things in my little world in Eastern Iowa. But then I went to grad school at Iowa State, and I have a whole different view of the world now because of that. And I'm actually trying to figure out, there's farmland that some that I've inherited and some more that I'm going to inherit that was very clearly stolen. And I'm trying to figure out how I can use that resource that I inherited to maybe cash that in and find a way to address in some tiny little way the systems that allowed me to get a lot of advantages and some other people not to have any at all. So I had to do a real big identity shift in looking at land grant universities. And I used to be really proud, oh, I work for land grant university. And I no longer say that now because we are just so much more aware of what had to happen to get to that. And I guess my biggest disappointment was it took until I went to grad school to figure that out. So I tried to share that thinking with my peers who didn't think about that stuff when we were undergrads or younger people. So
yeah. And this is part of the reason that I'm here, that I wanted to bring these conversations here, because it is amazing. I mean, I have been incredibly inspired by all of the sessions at this conference. I think we are so much farther along in this process than, even a decade ago. What conversations were happening in sustainable ag. But we still have a ton of work to do too.
Yes.
So yeah, thank you, Jean. Beth, would you like to share briefly?
Sure. Hi, I'm Beth Nelson, and I am in St. Paul, Minnesota. I'm associated with the University of Minnesota, but I also run a USDA grant-making program, Sustainable Ag Research and Education. So University of Minnesota, like many of the stories told, so we are a land grant institution. We have been trying to come to terms with some of what this means in terms of our relationship to the First Nations and the tribes in our state, or what we call our state. And we have had recently some seminars by Ricardo Salvador, who really tells it like it is, how much our current ag system and our land grants are built on the backs of slavery and stolen Indigenous land. I'm not sure how much we're doing about it at this point. And one of our University of Minnesota campuses was a boarding school where not that many years ago, Indigenous children were sent or were torn from their families and forced to go there. We are at SARE. So our institution is moving slowly. SARE is also an institution, but we are governed by farmers and ranchers and other people who work in sustainable ag, and they are can be pretty forward thinking, and they have charged us with trying to provide more research, more resources and outreach to Indigenous communities. So we're doing that primarily by interacting with the 1994s, which again, this is greatly ironic, but they were designated as land grant institutions. They're primarily tribal community colleges. And we have 20 of them in our 12-state upper Midwest region, which is part of North Central SARE. They were designated in 1994 as opposed to the Morrill Act 1862, when the larger land grants were designated. They get very few resources compared to us. And yes, it's their land. So there's a whole bunch of irony there, but we are trying to co-develop a program with those tribal community colleges that are 1994s that has fellows designated for 2 years to work on food sovereignty. And that will change every 2 years, and they'll be able to have a cohort of 4 that go back and forth. That's at least the original thinking, just getting started. But I think the main thing we want to do is we, as Hannah said in the beginning, it's mostly about building relationships and showing up continuously. And being where they invite you to be. And so we're starting that process. We'll see how the rest of it goes, but have started to work on some small food sovereignty issues with some of those groups.
Yeah, and one thing that came up in our group, I was with Beth and Angie, and you know, and thinking about the importance of understanding that mistakes are likely to happen. You know, we're all making an effort to make moves towards unsettling ourselves, or, you know, however you want to think about it. And that is part of this humbling nature of this work. But I think if you can keep that in mind, that relationships are so central, that can really help with the process of making mistakes and learning from them, and continuing to tend to those relationships so that they're not broken. But yeah, thank you, Beth. I'm looking forward to hearing how that goes for North Central SARE. Okay, let's see. Some people have moved around as cameras go on and off. I think Maritza, if you'd like to unmute and share.
Hi. So I was in the same group as Raylan and Ren, and I'm currently in Columbus, Ohio. I go to Ohio State University. I'm in the Rural Social Department of the School of Environment and Natural Resources. Then for me, I mean, a lot of things spoke to me. One was, what does it mean to do land acknowledgement at the beginning, as you mentioned, of meetings or events, and can we become complicit with doing just that? And it's a habit, it's something that we do, and we're like, oh, some bad thing happened, and we recognize that it did, and then it stops there. So also reflecting on, okay, what does that mean when I do it? And reflecting more on that, and thinking about, okay, what else can I do? And also recognizing that when it comes to privilege, I flow back and forth on the axis. And as far as like education goes, having done my education in Land Grant University, so I benefited from those resources. And what does that mean for how that clashes with some of my values and goals in life. Currently, my research focus is on African American farmers, and knowing how there's land grant and land grant. There's the 1862, there's the 1890, and how the population that I'm studying has been wronged by land grant institutions also in a way, and how for the 1862 universities to thrive, they had to really squeeze funding and denied funding for the 1890s institution. And what did that mean for Black extension agent and Black farmers in general in terms of the help that they receive? And being associated with this imposition and having to do research on African American farmers, there's like a tension there, and trying to think about how do I reconcile that as well. So that's where I'm at. I'm like in a whole of the conversation too much. And that's it for me. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that perspective. It's a really important one. And in the same way that Beth was talking about, there's this sort of irony or complexity, problematic nature of the tribal colleges as being part of land grants. There's also the HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and being part of that system also, and how African-American farmers have also, there are all of these ways that colonization and slave-based systems are perpetuated through land-based sciences in these institutions. And it's complicated. So yeah, thank you for bringing that up, and good luck with your work. That sounds really important. Let's see, I have Elena. I realize I'm saying everyone's names without asking how you like them said first, so forgive me if I'm saying them wrong. Or maybe we can go to Francesca. Or Ren. Okay, I'll take it that we're passing. Okay, multitasking, totally understand. I've been doing a lot of that with this conference too. I appreciate your honesty in that. So I'm going to go back to sharing just a few more slides, and then I hope that we'll have a little bit more time for some reflection and thinking about how do we respond to all of these big questions. So in my own research, I apologize for all of the words. I really try to avoid having wordy slides, but there's just so much to share. So in my own research with the Center for Agroforestry and thinking about how Land of the Osage's Research Center is going to be incorporated into our work, one of the big questions is, can Indigenous and Western scientific knowledge coexist at all? These are really different paradigms. And we talk about TEK, might be a familiar term for you, traditional ecological knowledge. We might shift to thinking more in terms of native science. Traditional ecological knowledge, that terminology has been critiqued for its sort of demeaning nature in placing those knowledges into the past as traditional. There are different perspectives on that. Certainly plenty of native scholars who are using TEK terminology still. But typically that's defined as this cumulative or collective community body of knowledge and beliefs that's handed down through generations by cultural transmission about the relationship of living beings with one another and their environment. That's a really broad way of thinking about the huge diversity of local ecological knowledges and Indigenous knowledges. And there are native and non-native scholars who are really thinking about this. Can these two ways, and not just two, many ways of thinking about the world, of being in the world, come together in a research or land-based sciences context? For my own work, I think that this can be an important question for potentially informing sustainable forest farming and agroforestry practices. Since, as Kelsey and Raylin mentioned, agroforestry is not new. These are practices that have been on the landscape for thousands of years. I think that this integration can also support the conservation and the biocultural, the preservation of Indigenous knowledges, and hopefully also contribute to Indigenous self-determination. That's sort of a theme. Indigenous research really needs to be contributing to Indigenous self-determination for it to avoid the more extractive tendencies of Western science in working with Indigenous peoples or on traditional Indigenous peoples. So that's sort of this last section there, is that there is this really troubling past that we need to confront and resist in this work. And so some of the things that I think are really important take homes in resisting the tendencies of Western science as it has been practiced for so long to exploit Indigenous peoples is to first acknowledge the power imbalances that are at play inherently in these relationships. moving away from research on and about Indigenous communities, as so often has been done, and moving towards research by, with, and for those communities. And this is connected to those power imbalances. In the institution where I work, we do not have the Indigenous leadership in place right now to really be doing the work that is by, with, and for. So making that shift is going to be slow. But if we can really keep those things in mind as goal points, I think that can serve us. And then really considering our own research paradigms, even from a more constructivist lens. And my own work has been primarily qualitative, but Indigenous paradigms, and this is, I'm speaking in a way that is, again, referring to these paradigms as a monolith, and they're really not. But one of the themes that really comes through in the authors that I've read, and Sean Wilson, again, is one that speaks quite a bit to this, a person who speaks to this, is that knowledge is relational. So coming back again and again to the relationships really being central, not just relationships between people, but relationships between people and ideas to each other, ideas to communities, and to the practices on the land as being part of that relationship. And there are some models that I think can be helpful in beginning this process, some that have been inspiring for me and that have been confirmed by some of the Osage co-researchers we're working with, is this community-based participatory research, CBPR. So if this is something you're interested in doing, more research with tribal communities, I encourage you to look into some examples using community-based participatory practices. Place-based learning communities is another model that really is taking all of these things into account, that we need co-researcher collaboration at all stages. There should be community-directed objectives. And I think, Beth Nelson's example with SARE is a good one in seeing that enacted. And that when there are research benefits, that they are directly coming back to serve those communities. Relational participatory action research is another one that uses a lot of those same approaches. So having an equal value to the community's knowledges and for the knowledge holders, a respect for leadership in the community and really including them as co-researchers, and throughout all of this having authentic relationships that are accountable, that where there is trust building. So that the relational accountability is terminology that's often used for thinking about how to piece all of these things together in this context. How can we support relational accountability in our work? And of course, my cat is taken over here. So some of the questions that I have been really musing about in this process are, what is the appropriate protocol for us in research partnerships or for research leadership from the Osage community at this MU Research Center? Again, this is not land that's been given back to the Osage community to have their own directive in whether they even want to work with the university, but that is something that we might think about too. So that coming to that last question there, thinking about opportunities for giving land back, for reconciling our relationship with this land at a land grant institution. And then how can we ensure that the research questions and objectives we pursue and in these spaces, ag experiment stations, are meaningful to and beneficial for really multiple communities. And this is something that I struggle with, is like, shouldn't we just leave this in the hands of the Osage Nation? But the Osage Nation, as I mentioned, there are multiple perspectives that can be problematic. There are tribal or traditional cultural advisory committees that can be helpful in that leadership, but it's never as simple as, let's just give the land back and see what happens. Maybe it could be, but is that really what the nation wants? Maybe, maybe not. We have to start asking those questions. So, these are themes that I think have come up in this process, but these are all really central to that relational accountability, that relationships are central, that authentic exchange, transparency, accountability, humility, that throughout all of this, it's a truly collaborative process that is moving towards tribal self-determination. And connected with that the research and education is relevant and directly benefiting those communities' interests. So I invited Raylan and Kelsey here to share a little bit about their experiences, in part because they were part of this first course that we offered in fall 2020 for justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and agroforestry. And so because, you know, in acknowledging the roots of agroforestry, as we mentioned, colonization and thinking about traditional ecological knowledges, native sciences, and the intersectionality, as Maritza mentioned too, of all of these concepts, slave-based systems and neoliberal capitalism. There's so much that's mixed into this and interrelated, really. So these are just some of the content areas that we covered in that course. But I wanted Raylan and Kelsey to be here too, to share if they had insights about how that experience, how that coursework affected their own thinking in their research or future plans. So Raylan and Kelsey, if you'd like to chime in at this point, you are more than welcome to. And then as we start this conversation, we'll move more into the sort of reflection and response and co-creating this Jamboard together for where we go from here. So I will stop sharing my screen in case Kelsey and Raylan want to offer any insights from that coursework.
Yeah, I can speak on it a little bit. So entering into the Jedi course, which if you haven't heard the abbreviation Jedi, it's Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So entering into that course, I was nervous because these issues can feel overwhelming and insurmountable and so deeply intertwined with one another and with the systems and structures that we operate within. And they are still all of those things, except insurmountable. I don't believe they're insurmountable. And beyond a dive into these issues, I think what the course taught me is the perspective that Rome wasn't built in a day. It took a long time for these systems to be established that are unjust. And likewise, Rome can't be torn down and rebuilt in a day. There's no one answer and instant fix all, except the slow and diligent work of intentionally reforming these systems and erasing these biases within the natural resource work we do on a daily basis. And it's intense work and it's long work, but it's work that we can do and it's work that we must do. And if I'm being honest, I was intimidated being someone that's cis and white. Do I have any place in Jedi efforts? Yes, I do, because we all do. Jedi work can't just be left to those in marginalized groups. It's unfair, again, to put the burden and responsibility for changing and reforming everything on those groups. And those who benefit from the current systems absolutely have the responsibility to reform it and leverage that privilege to pursue equity. So,
yeah, thanks for sharing, Kelsey. Yeah, that's something that, you know, taking that responsibility is such an important part of this work. And I think positioning can be a good place to begin in that. But yeah, I appreciate your sharing. Raylan, did you want to share a little too?
sure, I can add on to that. So speaking about the course directly, I know there's some people that work in university settings. I thought it was super powerful to have a course focused on examining the issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion in a natural resource context. I had taken courses, about this topic before. They were through a religious lens, like seeing how religion impacts our images and understandings of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And so it was a little bit more like broadly, like sociologically. And so narrowing it down to like how it's manifesting now in this area that I want to work in and build a career in, helped prepare me to think like, how can I help right where I am? And for me, a big takeaway is I sort of came from a place of thinking like, okay, so I have to do this work and I'm going to like make the change. And it was humbling to see how really my role is not so much like necessarily making changes directly, but making space for people to come in, because I don't know what other communities want and what other people are experiencing. So in that point, it was very humbling, and in some ways, like, it feels like a lot, but then I just know, like, okay, so it starts, as we had kind of mentioned in a theme here today, it starts with making relationships and like starting to build like a new, more inclusive community where we can work on these issues together. And it's not just like a one person has to face this. It's like we're going to do it together. And the more we talk about it, the more people will also feel passionate about it and want to continue making relationships and continue making changes. So I really enjoyed having a space to just talk about it and ask these honest questions and express and figure out where we all fit into the big picture.
Yeah, thanks, Raylan. Yeah, there is so much work to do, as we've been talking about, and it can be intimidating and really overwhelming. But I think, you know, even as someone who is, we tried to make the course as participatory and co-creative as possible, and so much of it is really conversation based. But being in the role that I was in, I felt really inspired in having this sort of collective, you know, that we're in this together. We are learning together, and we have a long way to go personally and in our institution. And you know, sometimes it feels a little futile too, to have the conversations like, okay, we're just talking about it and talking about it, and when do we get to the action? But I do think that our roles in academic spaces are important ones, because we have power in those spaces, and shifting that power is an important step. So thanks for being part of that course. And we're looking forward to continuing the course and continuing to learn from the students who are in that with us. I'll share my screen one more time here and go back to some of these big questions, the critical dialogues, the critical questions that we can be asking. So that are positioning ourselves as an important first step, thinking about the challenges and opportunities that we've experienced for those Jedi justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, accessibility efforts in land-based sciences education, whether that's in an academic institution or not. How you might like to be or are currently operationalizing your values towards justice, equity, accessibility, diversity, et cetera. And what does it look like in your own biocultural context to be enacting cultural competence and cultural humility? So at this point, if you haven't already, the Jamboard link is right there. It's also in the chat. I encourage everyone to check that out. I will copy these questions into the chat also. And I would like to take the next, let's just do a 5-minute time to break out again and talk in smaller groups, so everyone has a chance to think a little bit more deeply and openly in a safe and brave space for these. And we will come back together at 2:20 to, I wonder if I can recreate, maybe I'll let participants choose a room for this time. Is everyone seeing that okay? The breakout rooms? No, okay, I'm just gonna do them automatically then, because I think I was having trouble with that yesterday on my phone, doing Whova on the phone, that the breakout room option doesn't pop up. So I think if I do this to assign automatically, well, that's making it unassigned. Everyone's been invited. I'm just going to close all the rooms again and try this one more time. Thanks for everyone's patience. Breakout rooms, and I want to assign automatically. Here we go. Okay, and we have different people in different rooms now. So Let's take the next 5 minutes. I'll copy these questions, these reflection questions into the chat. And then one or more people in each group can open up that Jamboard. And if you're not familiar with using Jamboard, you'll just want to look at the tools on the left side of that screen. And you can make little Post-it notes or add a text box. There are lots of ways to contribute on the Jamboard, but we'll be looking at that first slide for reflection and response. Thinking within our own unique biocultural context, how we would like to be enacting some of these reflections. So I'll open the rooms and copy those questions in the chat.
Yeah, maybe send a broadcast message to ask people to come back. Oh, everybody's coming back. Never mind.
I sent a message to you. I just realized I was muted. Chatting there, but yeah, hopefully everyone will come back together. The time really flies when we're having good conversations.
I just want to ask the group. So I don't see like the chat. Again, I didn't see the questions in the chat when you put it out.
Oh no. Okay. Did you see the Jamboard link? Did you make it to that?
I didn't see it in my chat.
I put some things on the Jamboard as Raylan and I were talking, hopefully.
Okay. I wonder if, so I've been adding things to the Zoom chat, but if you're in Whova, there's a separate Whova chat. And I did not think about that as having to be in that space too. So hopefully we didn't have too many people missing out from that.
Yeah, I can see that. I'm on Zoom and I can see the chat. It's just like when we're in breakout rooms and you said you were going to post the questions. It's like it doesn't go to the breakout room.
No, it only goes to the breakout room of the room that you're in.
I see. Well, my bad on that. Apologies. I added some question prompts to the Jamboard in hopes that that would help to be where you are. But it looks like we have some really nice things that are added here. You all will have access to this link. And because it is 2:30 now, I don't think we have time to do any more full group reflection, but I hope that folks will use this space to add your name and contact information if you'd like to stay connected. I have started a listserv that formed from an agroforestry specific conference, a national agroforestry conference, on these topics specifically. And if you're interested in staying part of that, it's a space for sharing resources, for sharing about the work that we're doing and the lessons that we're learning, and to continue to stay in touch. So please feel free to, on the second slide in the Jamboard, if you'd like to be added to that list, put your name and email there, and then feel free to continue adding resources on the third slide. Or yeah, if you add your email to the chat, if you haven't made it to the Jamboard, I'd be happy to add you to the list that way too. So thank you all. I'm sorry we don't have more time together. There's always more to talk about, but best of luck to everyone with all of this really challenging work. And thank you so much for being part of the conversation today. It was nice to meet you all.
Thank you, everybody. Bye.